On this episode of Low Buck Garage, I work on some transmission issues. Oh, hey, this looks bad. I do some body work. Whoops. I find a good use for a rusty old gear. And then this happens. I'm here in a boat in the middle of the Rio Grande. This is not what I intended to do in this video. This video ended up going a little differently than I expected, but it worked out great and I had a lot of fun. So why don't you come along for the ride? When I first built this buggy, I put in a transmission that I knew was bad. It had no reverse gear. It worked fine for most driving. Every once in a while it was important to go backwards. And that took a little more effort than I wanted. So I bought another transmission and drove this buggy on the lift to swap it out. This NV3500 is rated for torque up to about the 5.2 V8, which is what it came behind. This is the 5.9 360 version with a lumpy cam. So I went a little bit different to replace it. I went with an AX15 out of a V6 Dakota. Now those are only put behind 6 cylinders, not V8s, but I got a really good deal on it. It looks like it'll fit. I've had trouble getting motivated on this project, so I'm having so much fun with other ones, but right now this is holding up other projects. So today I am going to get this buggy off the lift. So far, this little bitty drive shaft held together with a piece of exhaust tubing is actually holding up. And I had held this yoke in with a bearing retaining compound, and that still seems in there pretty firmly. That seemed to have worked. Luckily, I've never hooked a proper ignition switch to this. It's always been run off one of those little buttons. I've never actually had a solenoid wire, so I don't need to detach it. So that right there saves time. There we go. On these Mopars, there's one bolt right behind this oil filter that holds the engine to the transmission. And you gotta yank the oil filter in order to get to it. It's a lot easier to get to these bell housing bolts without a floor. I forgot to take the shift lever off. But luckily that's easy to get to from the bottom. And there she goes. This is the piece I made to make this 4-wheel drive transmission work as a stubby 2-wheel drive one. This is also a good time to look inside and see what happened and if anything went wrong. And this whole thing slides out as a unit. And hopefully this diameter, which is machined to fit this NV3500, fits the AX15. I get spoiled by these aluminum transmissions. While I have them out, we can take a look at a comparison of these two transmissions. You can see this is one piece, there is no separate bell housing. Shift tower is in just about the same spot, because these are Dakotas. If it was from a Ram truck, the shifter would be forward about 3 inches. In the AX15, there's removable bell housing. This AX15 is supposed to be from an early 90s Dakota with a 3.9 V6. So that's the same bolt pattern here as the V8. So that should bolt on. It appears that the throwout, bearing, and everything looks almost identical. On the rear here, it looks roughly the same, though that has a seal right at the end. So we may have an issue bolting this on. That's not going to work. I got a problem here. And it just runs into that seal there. This NV3500 was real deep in here, so I had plenty of room to work with. My bearing sticks out pretty good, so I can't actually slide it in so it'll hit the seal. Also, that seal keeps the transmission oil in the transmission. I don't have a provision for that here. So that means all the fluid would leak out if I tried to use this. So today, instead of doing a quick and easy replace this transmission with that one, we are now going with a how do we fix this transmission without any extra parts. When I bought this transmission, it was dirt cheap. And I asked the guy if it worked, and he was a little bit evasive about that. I bought it anyway because it had this nifty B&M aftermarket shifter on it. I figured I could use that if nothing else. And that alone was worth what I paid for the whole thing. That's real basic and simple. Which means we got to dig further. We got to drain this thing out and split the case open. Would have been a better idea to drain it in the vehicle, than hanging off an engine hoist. But we'll get it taken care of. Oh, that's pretty black. The drain plug definitely has some debris on it. Now it's times like this that you want to basically take a pause for a minute and check online or some manual and see if there's an easy guide to how to take these apart. I'm going to go directly to taking it apart without looking that up at all, because I might learn something along the way, and it'll be fun. Now I see a bolt right here. I don't know what that does, but I'm going to do some gentle prying. This whole thing doesn't pop apart easy. I'm going to take that bolt out. Oh, there's another one right here. I'm going to take off both these. Oh yeah, that definitely does something. It goes in there real deep. Oh, it's moving a little now. Now I can feel the case moving slightly, but this shaft isn't. I'm worried that that oil seal in there has to come out, and I'm betting there's a snap ring behind it holding a bearing onto the shaft, and I need that to come off before I slide the whole thing off. The problem is, I don't have a spare. My flat blade screwdriver with a bit of a hook on the end, I was able to tap it in, get under this lip, and pop it out. I might even be able to reuse it. Yep, there's a snap ring. There we go. Now you never should take a sharp object and go right onto a sealing surface like this one, particularly if you were about to hit it with a hammer. Definitely do not do this, if you care about your transmission. Oh, hey, something metal just fell inside. That's gonna bite me later. I'll remove this bolt and see what happens. That definitely located something. There is a spiral pin holding that on. I guess we might as well just drive it out and see what happens. There we go. That was what we needed to do. Oh, oh, hey, this looks bad. This right here is supposed to be shifting the transmission. That's a problem. There's more loose pieces in there. More broken chunks. Maybe I'll do a quick look in the classifieds. I'm betting I can probably buy a whole transmission for less than that piece costs. I spent a while looking at all the usual online places to find a cheap NV3500. Eventually I did find one. It's not for sale though. It's this one. This is my 97 Grand Cherokee. It's a 5.2 Magnum, and you may have seen it before. I did a 5-speed swap in a multi-part video series. This thing works great. So I'm gonna pull the transmission out now. I figure I'll do one last run here. That way I can remember what it used to be like when it worked. If you haven't driven one of these with a V8 and a 5-speed, you should. They're perky. Let's bring her in and tear apart this properly working vehicle to make something sketchier. I was right about one thing. This buggy's coming off the lift. I need this lift to drive the other Jeep in, to steal the transmission out of, to swap that one, to get the transmission I need to put in this. I'm sure this makes sense somehow. In order to take the transmission out of this Jeep, I want to put up my lift, which means I need to take the boat off. But before I take the boat off, I got to finish doing a few things up there. When I made this boat loader, I just strapped the boat down with tie downs. What I want to do is make something that locates the boat side to side and bolts it on securely so it doesn't move anywhere. I've got these rails here, so I'm seeing this nice thick rail on the boat. I think if I do a little angle between the two, I can weld it here, bolt it on there. And these braces go up at a bit of an angle, so if I kick it over a little bit, it'll slide into place. Found this bit of angle in my scrap bin. I think this will work fine. So something along this lines. I'm gonna have to bend this 90 a little bit tighter to fit that angle going in, but that's fine. So I'm just gonna take this piece, divide it by 4, and whatever that number is, that's the exact length I want. Okay, we've got 13.5 long. Half of that is 6 3/4. Half of that is 3 3/8. And that's the exact length I was looking for. Precisely 1/4 of what I had lying around. And that's the angle I need. There we go, we got our new angle. Now I just tack these in place because weld beads and windows don't mix well. And then once I flip this down, I'll fully weld it up. At least I have my positioning set. And speaking of positioning, I need to make sure this boat goes in the same spot. So I'm actually gonna drill straight through these brackets right into the rails on the boat. If you don't feel like drilling through your boat, some people don't. There's oar locks and other things like that. You can make tabs too. But this seems easier and I don't mind drilling. Transfer case is coming out first, so I can see whether or not this whole swap looks plausible. Come on, there you go. Now the transfer case input has a sealing surface. Hopefully it fits that AX15. Apparently you need to make sure you have that in gear before you take the shift tower off. Good thing I read that. So I'm going to test fit that bearing, make sure it fits. Moment of truth. Did I waste the past few hours? Nope. That fits in there perfect. Splines are right, everything looks good. Nice and tight fit. This is going to work. Now the other part of the equation, will this transfer case fit the AX15? All right, we hit the oil seal. That fits. Now before I take this NV3500 out, let me show you where we're at. When I originally put this in, I knew an NV3500 never came in this chassis, so I didn't even bother looking for a mount that would fit. I just went ahead and used a generic mount, went down to a plate. I ended up moving the Crossmember. Originally it was right here. I moved it up a little bit, then had the plate, and then the mount, and that went up to the transmission. But I also know this ZJ chassis did come with an AX15 behind the 4 liters, and those mounts are still available. So I went ahead and bought one. This bolts the transmission, it has the mount behind it. I know this fits the AX15 with the 4 liter. I don't know if it'll fit the AX15 with the 5.2 liter, but before I take this NV3500 out, I'm gonna see if it fits an NV3500, because they look real similar. So let's try that. Looks like the AX15 mount bolts fine to this NV3500, so that's good. Now, this mount is meant for the early ZJ Crossmember. Luckily I have one lying around. Now if I line this up with the mount, it looks like it'll all bolt in. This Crossmember is way too far forward. So let's try it with the AX15. At least 80% of the bolts are out, I think. Maybe. It's wiggling, so that's a good thing. Shift tower out. Before I install this, add a little grease in the pivot ball cup on the input shaft. I even went the extra mile and popped the 20 bucks for a new throwout bearing. Something like this. There we go. I even went and got a new seal for the output shaft here. Remember that oil seal that seals on the transfer case? That's what holds the transmission oil in. If you forget about that, you can run into an issue. That's not an issue on the NV3500 because it has a seal on that shaft, so the oil doesn't come out if you tip it. I just didn't think about it till it was spilling because the other one came out and I could tip it wherever. Oh well, I got speedy dry. I'm gonna go ahead and throw this transfer case on. It was a real pain to get these top bolts when it was up there. Much easier. That went almost too easy. Sometimes I laugh at the number of tools I have, duplicates of the same thing. But when you need 4 feet of extensions to get all the way from the back of the transfer case to a bell housing bolt up front, you're glad you have all those tools. I have the factory AX15 mount set up, mocked up here. Now for comparison, this is my 4 liter ZJ with an AX15. Here's my mount, bolts on the same way, goes into this Crossmember, and the Crossmember bolted in the original location. So that all fits fine with the 4 liter and the AX15 for the 4 liter. So we're on the transmission where we should be. We have the Crossmember and all the factory ZJ stuff in place with the V8 version. the crossmember does not line up. That's the original hole. Now that's not insurmountable. You could take the factory mount and extend it that way. You could drill new holes into this channel. Since I already made a mount system that works, I'm gonna go back to that because it's already done, and that's easier than doing something new. If you're doing a fresh installation, definitely consider the factory mount and then moving it or the crossmember. Before I put that crossmember on there, I want to deal with the transfer case shifter. So I see there are some holes on the side of this transmission. I want to see if they actually work. The exact same shifter bolts to both the NV3500 and the AX15. So that's not even a problem I have to solve, it's just done. Got my transmission bolted in. This is the crossmember setup I had made before. And previously I had used the first two holes in the transmission and I moved the entire crossmember forward one hole. This time I was able to bolt it to the back. Now the crossmember is in the factory bolt holes. So that's all back to the original position. And the big advantage of that, these holes here are for the factory skid plate. Got a factory skid plate here and I'm about to attach it, I hope. These are the bolt holes in the crossmember it's supposed to go in. There's no threads, so you can't actually put a bolt straight in. And then on the top side there's an access hole, but it's got a plate welded on top of it. Gonna have to go with one of these nuts on a stick. I'm gonna take this, fish it in, and that way I actually have a nut on the back side. And then you just have to do a little fishing. There we go. And now the piece of metal will act like the wrench on the back side, and it'll be there when you go to take it out too. Now I'm about to put on this dust cover. I noticed it has a drip right down the front of it. That's a good indication that my rear main seal is leaking. I'm just gonna completely ignore that because I figure since I'm putting a 6-cylinder transmission behind a V8, I'm probably gonna get down here again after that explodes. So we'll just put this back on and pretend we never saw it. The bolt up top lines up. This bolt lines up. This bolt lines up. This indentation lines up. Next hole lines up. This one lines up. Starter holes are nowhere close. This is where the starter hole in the bell housing is. Right there. It is way off. The one up top is off too. That one on the back side is right about here. Since I don't have the correct flywheel cover, I went through my hoard of miscellaneous flywheel covers. I think this is actually from the automatic, which puts the starter on the wrong side. This one might be from a 4-liter. That one's just too tiny to do anything useful. This one, I actually had bought this new and it didn't fit what I bought it for, and I've had it sitting around since. This one's wrong for this application too, but it's a lot less wrong than some of the other ones. So we're gonna use this one and just modify it a little bit. Upper bolt looks fine. This bolt holds the brace, looks fine. This one is way off. We're just gonna put a new hole somewhere in this general area. The next brace one fits, which is good. That one fits. Their starter holes are way off. That means this large hole for the starter is probably off too. I'm just gonna go ahead and, let's say just slice the whole thing off right about here. I didn't mark this particularly well, so we'll just make an extra big hole. Now I've got this piece, and that actually seems to fit the starter fine. All right, so we'll line those up there, and then somewhere around there, I need to slice. Got all the bolts lined up on the bottom piece. I got some studs to the starter in, and the top piece is in place. So all I have to do is run a little bit of a weld on that seam, hook them together, spray a coat of paint on it, and it'll be perfect. So I'm gonna call it good enough and bolt it in as is. Being two pieces shouldn't be a problem. Everything's bolted in and all together. Gotta install the front drive shaft next. And I was just sitting here looking around and wiggling this. Then I heard a sound from over here. That U-joint shot. Then I took a look at this one. That one shot too. Since they're both the same, I figure that's symmetric, so we're gonna ignore that and just pop the front drive shaft in. The center piece of this U-joint is loose also. So looks like pretty soon in my future I'm gonna have a day of U-joints on this Jeep. But that day isn't today. We'll save that for another time. I'm sure these will be fine until then. The fellow I got this transmission from warned me to check for water in it before I used it. Yeah, it's always good to get tips like that. Oh no, that's not bad. It does look pretty black. So we'll just put something new in. Since the gear shift lever's already out, I'm gonna fill the transmission from the top. It's a lot easier. Now I started using this Pennzoil Synchro Mesh fluid. when I got my 6-speed Liberty, because I found out that apparently Chrysler didn't bother filling up those transmissions from the factory, and a lot of them went bad because they didn't have enough oil in them. Now that thing required stuff that met the Chrysler MS9224, so I found the cheapest one I could find that did that, which is this Pennzoil stuff. And then come to find out it also meets GL3, which is what these AX15s use. So I've been using this in pretty much everything, and so far it's worked. Now the same Jeep that I salvaged that transfer case skid plate from also had a gas tank skid plate. So I'm going to go ahead and install that. Now that uses the same bolts as these hitches, and the hitch is holding up my boat loader. So I'm going to try to do one side at a time, use a jack to support it, take the bolts out, put the skid plate in, put it back together, and then switch to the other side. There's a reinforcing rib here that doesn't want to let it go over. We'll just persuade it a little more. Perfect. Now we're in there. There. Now the gas tank has a little bit of armor too. When I painted this Jeep initially, I put on this gray cladding because I had a full set lying around. I didn't really like that color, but I'd already installed it and I just painted it, so the paint was still soft. If I tried to pry that stuff off, I would have destroyed the paint. But now the paint's dry, so I think I can take the cladding off without damage. So I'm going to pop this off, and I found a mismatched set that I just sprayed semi-gloss black. Since it has a black leather interior, I think this will kind of work better. We'll try it out and see. Let's do a quick summary of where we're at with this dune buggy transmission swap that this video is about. So far I took this transmission out. The spare transmission's in the Jeep. All the stuff's hooked up on the Jeep. I've started painting some of the body cladding in the Jeep. So far I've been completely distracted by that project and haven't even touched this one that I'm supposed to be working on. So everything's going as expected. We're making a lot of progress on a different project. Now I've got this bumper guard off to paint it, and while I do that, I'm going to add one more thing. From the same Jeep I pulled those skid plates off of, I've got a set of front factory tow hooks. Now that Jeep was wrecked, so these are kind of bent up a little bit, but this Jeep was also wrecked and totaled. So the unibody's bent up on this one too. I got to do some straightening of some of the bumper mounts in order to get those to fit again. So rather than straighten this out ahead of time, I'm just going to cram it on and sort of mush the two together until they fit, because neither one is straight. I'm going to start with the less bent of the two tow hooks. Now these mount with 2 bolts to this front cross member, and then 4 bolts up there behind the horns. They have little backing plates. This is a 2-bolt pair that goes in right here. Then a 4-bolt flange that backs up the piece that goes in what pretends to be a frame rail. First thing I noticed is I can't actually put this one in because that AC condenser is there. Now I could just smush that out of the way, but every once in a while the AC works on this and I like that. So I'm going to unbolt this and move it upwards. I had to undo the top bolt of the condenser and a couple screws in the bracket. Got a little bit of movement now. Now this backing plate gets fished into this hole. We'll use that. A lot of wiggling. There we go. Got 1 bolt started. Now I just got to get the rest to line up. Having a lot of trouble getting those bolts. I think I'm going to take out these horns to make life easier. Well, that's a lot better. Now, as mangled as this tow hook bracket was from the wreck, I expected to have to do a lot of tedious straightening and bending to get it to fit. But just by wiggling it around, I got all the bolts in. They're not lined up particularly well and they're at funny angles. But I figure if I just crank them down, the unibody and the bracket will kind of just form to each other and it should fit perfect. Let's see how this works. All right. All the bolts are tight. That thing's in there. I'll just have to make sure every time I get stuck, I have to get pulled that way, and this should straighten itself out in no time. This bracket here has a little pin that's supposed to hold the front bumper out here somewhere. That got smushed when this was wrecked. Whoops. There we go. That's more like it. Now we just got to adjust this bottom piece. There. That should be fine. Alright, around the tow hook. Probably should have checked this first. The piece that slides over that is missing from this bumper cover. So none of that mattered at all. I shouldn't have bothered. Great. There we go. Perfect. All the plastic clips that are supposed to hold this light in are broken off. I see a nice pad there that looks like a good attachment point. There we go, all set. One thing that's been bugging me is my steering wheel doesn't go on center. So while we're under here, we're gonna go ahead and adjust the drag link and center that steering wheel up. I'm really making a lot of progress on this dune buggy transmission swap. It's going great. This entire boat loader pivots on this tube that goes through the receiver, which is nice and sturdy, but nothing really locates it side to side. I didn't care before, because if these tubes rub the bumper, it was no big deal. But now I'm going to go ahead and paint this bumper the semi-gloss black to match everything else, so I don't want these scraping. So I want to locate this side to side. What I'm going to do is take an old flange bearing and just mount that right here on the tube. So as it pivots, it'll just roll along this flat plate, and that should locate it without stopping it from moving. There, all set. Now I got to button up the interior of this Jeep, but I figure there's a couple minor details I want to check first. Like if the starter actually works in the new position of the bell housing, if the clutch works, and if the transmission works. If I'm lacking one of those minor details, I might need to do a little bit more work. Starter works. Clutch feels normal. Transmission crunches. Take off the e-brake. Feels like this is going to go somewhere. Alright, time to button it up. Wrapping things up in here, I noticed a couple things. I was going to change out this giant shift boot that came with the AX15 to the one I already had from the NV3500. The shift levers are distinctly different lengths. I'm going to go with the shorter one. The thread's the same, so they're just interchangeable. The other thing I noticed, it looks like this AX15 shifter is just a little bit further forward. So, it bumps just a little bit. I bent the old adapter bracket on the front here to a new position to shove it forward. Now I'm going to put a couple new holes in the back here to hold it in place. Doesn't really want to fit, but it's only plastic. We'll make it fit. Once you're in gear, there's no pressure being put on the shift lever by the console. There's just a tiny little gap, so we're going to call that good enough. There, all buttoned up. Now this boat loader isn't particularly heavy, but I figure I can make it a little easier to deal with, especially the boat on top of it. So I drilled a couple holes through the side of the frame rail, found a piece of pipe that's almost long enough. I found some bushings that are just a little too small for this pipe. I found a piece of tubing that fits the bushings nicely, but is way too loose in this hole. I found a piece of tubing that is the right size for this hole, but is way too big for the bushings. And I found that this tube fits inside this one. So from these parts, we're going to make something better. Now the bushings fit. Found some bits of pipe in my scrap bin that'll take care of the pipe not long enough issue. And by adding a coupler in the middle, I'll be able to disassemble the whole thing. So this will work out perfect. Got my coupler added, random bit of pipe, And I have a box full of old rusty gears just for things like this. But I'm going to go ahead and weld this gear on, and if I do need to take it apart, I can unscrew it at that coupler and slide this piece out, so it's still replaceable. The gear's on there, and I found this little piece of boat winch. This will be handy. Somewhere around there should do fine. Old master cylinder spring. These ratchet straps are just about the right length. Not going to need this part anymore. Found a handle in my stash. That'll be better. Now I can lock it in whatever position I want to match the boat on any terrain. So I like that part. I made it a little too tall. Keep this in mind if you do it. Learn from my mistakes. Oh well, tiptoes work. And then as it goes over center, these actually hold on and keep it from going forward too far. I can let it on the roof in a controlled manner. Now the rest of the trim is looking pretty nice. This bumper is the last piece that hasn't been painted. But it's going to be real tricky to take off with all the cutouts and everything. I don't want to bother, so I'm going to paint it while it's on the vehicle. So I waited until I had ideal lighting conditions. By painting after dark, that visibility won't get in the way of not caring how it looks. So this will come out fine, at least tonight. Do some proper masking. There we go. This will come out great. It's already looking better. I think the bumper looks fine, definitely in the good enough range. And I started to paint the loader here, and then I realized I might want to weld on some more stuff into the back here and maybe some braces or something. So I stopped painting partway through. Coincidentally, just about the time I ran out of paint. So that worked out perfect. Almost dropped the boat there. Let's try putting the bottom in first. There we go. Now we're making some progress. Right now, I have these straps hooked to the back part of the roof rack, so that way it can pull the boat off. So everything can pull the boat that way, nothing is holding it down. So I'm going to move those straps to the front roof rack, try to use the same ratchet to tie it down. Now we're locked in place. That thing's on there sturdy. Bolted to the rack, ratchet attached to the vehicle straight through the hitch receiver and tied down to the roof rack so it can't wiggle at all. I'm considering that a solid mount. Well, I really should try it out, shouldn't I? Okay. In order to properly finish up our dune buggy transmission swap video, I'm headed to the biggest river around. So big, in fact, the name translates directly to Big River. We're going to try out this boat loader, see if that works. Oh yeah, transmission's working too. That's minor. Almost forgot about that part. I think I'm gonna have to modify the center console a little more. I think putting my arm on it made it move around. Did about 1500 RPM at 50. That puts it at 3000 RPM at 100. 2250 at 75. That's not bad. That's a pretty decent cruising RPM. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with this transmission. I've been driving around in this river for a while and I haven't found any water yet. But I'm going to unload the boat anyway because it is a river and I want to try this thing out. So let's see how it works. There. It's easy as that to unload your boat while parked in the middle of the river. And that is how I ended up in a boat in the middle of a Rio Grande. It's starting to rain, probably not enough to get this boat floating. So I'm going to pack it up and go. But I'm real happy with how it turned out anyway. I took care of a lot of things in that Jeep I was meaning to take care of. The X15 seems fine. I'll give you a long-term update after I drive it for a while. But that looks okay. And now I have a transmission loose that should fit my dune buggy. And maybe next time that transmission swap will actually go according to plan. Hope you guys are having fun too, even if your project doesn't go as planned. And we'll see you next time. Now I gotta get this thing loaded up before the wind picks up too bad. There's a few more times I get it right. All right, up she goes. There we go. Solid as anything. I'm pretty happy with that.